Welcome to the Business Extra. I'm Mustafa Al-Rawi, the National's Assistant Editor-in-Chief. Today we're going to be talking about the outlook for the Middle East and Central Asia in terms of the rest of the year and going into 2023. In a moment, I'm going to talk to Jihad Azour from the IMF. Before I do that, if you like this show, please do subscribe. If you're on YouTube, ring that bell. Well, as I said, I'm happy to be joined by the IMF's Jihad Azour. Jihad, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Mustafa, for having me.
So I want to talk a little bit about the regional economic outlook that you're putting out this week. You're in the UAE, but let me set the scene with the sort of global picture that we're coming into, which is obviously energy prices are high. We have an energy crisis in Europe and elsewhere. The interest rate environment has become far more hawkish. Central banks are raising rates to tame inflation, which is obviously connected to the energy and commodity price rises. But also, the predictions are the knock-on effect will be, as we end 2022, the forecast is that we will be entering a slowdown. And this is where, Jihad, you come in with your latest regional economic outlook. How does that fare given the wider context?
Well, again, Mustafa, thank you for having me. You raised the important question. The region is still faring in terms of recovery well, despite the change in the global outlook. Three important factors globally affect the region. One is the increase in energy and commodity prices that mainly fueled inflation. And for the oil importing countries, this is an issue to address. The second is the capital flows and the financial conditions. Tighter financial conditions led to outflows and increase in interest rates. And three, the level of uncertainty and the slowdown in demand will have an impact on the region. 2022 is a year where the region is still recovering well, with the level of growth reaching 5%, 5.2% for oil exporters, 4.9% for the oil importers, yet with the diversity between countries. Next year, we expect growth to slow down. There are three things that are important to watch this year. One is the level of inflation that keep growing and reach double digit for the third year in a row for several countries. Two, the financial conditions. And three, I think what is going to be very important is the level of or the nature of policies that the government will put in place in order to address the various shocks that the global economy is facing, and two, to protect their population against the social pressure.
So you raised some key points there, and you and I, we'd spoken a little under 6 months ago when we were looking ahead to how the region might fare in 2022. And one of the main things that we discussed was resilience. And so it seems as if what we discussed then has borne out well, that the region has actually proved fairly resilient. Is that fair?
Yes, but at a high cost. One, we see vulnerabilities coming from the COVID era. The level of informality went up, the level of unemployment went up too. Third year in a row in terms of inflation, that mainly it's headline inflation driven by food and fuel. This has an impact on the economic and social stability. Three, the high level of debt for several countries in the region who access finance internationally with the tightening of monetary policy, increase in rates, and the reversal of capital flows. Those are important issues. I think what is important today is to protect economies from inflation, and this requires monetary policy to control and reduce the level of inflation. Two, shift social protection to be more targeted and protect those who need social transfers. Three is preserve macroeconomic stability, especially in a context of slowdown and high uncertainty. Four, accelerate transformation through structural reforms. Those are the four dimensions. Country by country specific reforms are needed, but broadly speaking, it's very important to look forward and make sure that we use wisely the time that the countries in the region have.
So you mentioned targeted social support and reforms, and it seems in the last 6 months that governments have been acting on that, and particularly when it comes to Egypt, for example, that there has been some real progress on that front. So, did you expect that to continue going forward?
Well, yes, of course. As you know, we have reached staff level agreement with Egypt on a program. This program has 4 pillars. One of them is to preserve macroeconomic stability, and the recent measure taken by the central bank in terms of adjusting the interest rate to control inflation, it's a step in the right direction. Protecting Egypt from external shocks, and there are many external shocks, and the flexibility in exchange rate will help in that. 3 is to anchor fiscal in a sustainable and preserve primary surplus, and with the objective of having a 2% primary surplus in the budget. This is also an important element. Protecting social cohesion by strengthening the social programs is also an important part of the agenda of the Egyptian government. Last but not the least, Egyptian economy has huge potential. It needs to grow, and structural reforms and revisiting the role and the size of the state will help in this direction.
I mean, we saw top line growth this year for Middle East, North Africa is just over 5% GDP expansion, which is pretty solid. But it looks like that's going to decelerate in 2023 as we go forward. What are the main things that are going to drag on growth as we go into next year? Is it just kind of the global picture, or are there specific things related to countries here?
We already start seeing a certain number of countries decelerating. I would say even the majority of countries. What will? The global outlook. Globally, we see growth going down and revised regularly. We see interest rates going up and the financial conditions getting tighter and tighter. We see the food security as still an issue for most countries in the region. Not only the price of food, but also the price of fertilizers, which is an important component of agricultural activities. And also, we see the need to control inflation, and controlling inflation would require a certain number of measures that have side effect. And some of the side effect is the impact on growth.
And I mean, maybe this is a silly question, but it seems like inflation, well, if it's a silly question, I shouldn't ask it, but let's say it's a good question. If we say inflation is persisting and inflation continues to be the main focus of action, why does inflation persist? If everyone understands this is what we need to do, is it a factor beyond the control of most policymakers?
Look, I would say here there are 2 elements that are important to mention. One, there is a lag between the decisions and their impact. And this lag could be between 6 months, 1 year, depends on the transmission mechanisms. The second impact is the nature of inflation. This inflation is very much driven by food and commodity prices, and therefore it hurts socially. This is why it's very important to address it in order to alleviate the pressure on the low-income people. Addressing it would require a certain number of tightening in the monetary policy, which means increasing interest rates, making the financing conditions more challenging. And this will have an impact on growth. There is no solution without a cost. What is important is to have the right mix of policies and mitigate the cost of those policies on the group of people who need state support.
And if I touch upon Lebanon for the moment, obviously there's been several key moments for the country. We have the end of the presidential term for Michel Aoun, but also last week we had the historic agreement on the maritime border deal for between Israel and Lebanon as well. But Lebanon itself economically needs to move forward. We spoke 6 months ago and we discussed all aspects of what could happen. What's your take at the moment on the outlook for Lebanon specifically?
6 months ago, when we discussed the fact that staff level agreement between the fund and Lebanon has been reached, and that required certain number of measures to be introduced before enacting this program. Those are still important measures. Those measures will help address the financial, both state and financial sector issue. Will also address the public finance sustainability that is very much needed in order to maintain the level of public services. 3, restore confidence. Restoring confidence would require also to tackle corruption and governance issues and address the issue of inflation, especially given the level of inflation that Lebanon has reached. Therefore, all these measures are important. Certain number of laws are still needed to move forward with the program. More importantly, I think it's very important to put Lebanon back on track and restore both economic confidence and restore the capacity for Lebanon to address some of the acute problems that the Lebanese economy and society are facing currently.
So lastly, let's have a look at the Gulf economies, because again, if I talk about our previous conversation, we said that they had as exporters of energy products had a different position than perhaps other countries in the region, and they were looking good. And we talked about this historic era, a windfall that perhaps was not necessarily expected or planned for, and how to use it effectively and responsibly. But what's your view on the Gulf economies going forward, Jihad?
Gulf economies benefited from a positive term of trade shock. That with the increase in oil and gas prices, it improved their economic outlook. But this is not the only thing that they are benefiting from. They are benefiting from the result of the reforms that they were introduced in the last 5 years that allowed them to diversify their economy as well as also to diversify their public finance. They're benefiting from the various measures they introduced during COVID in order to allow the economy to recover fast. Going forward, what is important is to maintain economic management anchored into a medium-term approach. On the fiscal, maintain the medium-term fiscal frameworks, keep accumulating additional buffers, and reduce the risk of pro-cyclicality. Economically, accelerate economic transformation through increased participation of the private sector, accelerate some of the reforms like the labor market reforms, the doing business reforms that increase productivity. And 3, be protected because the global headwinds are growing and the economic sky is now filled with a gloomy prospect. Therefore, it's very important to protect their economies from the headwinds that we are currently facing.
Jihad Azour of the IMF, thanks so much for being with us. We'll talk again, I'm sure, next year.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's all we've got time for today. If you've enjoyed this show, I hope you do stay with us and subscribe to the program. All that remains to thank our production team and you all for being with us. Join us again next time.